Go live. Okay, perfect. So I think we can start. Let me just make sure that we are on YouTube. Okay. Yes. We are also on YouTube. So if Dr. Abdullah اگر اشکرام خود دنگ خود بگری تمام کومنت گستی کرد گله سپاس. Okay, we are live on YouTube, so let me start. Dambash, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who are joining us today from different time zones around the world. My name is Sardar Saadi, and I am the director of the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Rojava. On behalf of the Institute and the university's community, I'm pleased to welcome you all to the second lecture of the University of Rojava's Freedom Annual Lecture Series. Today, we are honored to host Professor John Holloway, who is joining us from Puebla, Mexico, to present his lecture titled Hope in Hopeless Times. We wish we could host you all on the university's campus in Qamishli, but for now, Zoom has been a working alternative, of course not desirable, to bring us together. Professor Holloway's lecture is part of the research theme for this year's program at the university, which is decolonization, and we are hoping to conclude this year by a summer school program on theories and practices of decolonization with a focus on Kurdistan. Details of that will be available in the coming weeks. Let me make some housekeeping notes. So this lecture is currently being live streamed on Zoom, on YouTube, the University of Rojava's YouTube channel. We have interpretation options from English to Kurdish Kermanji and vice versa. As always, Mr. Jalil Kaya is helping us today with interpretation. You can click on the globe icon on the right bottom side of your Zoom page and select Kurdish or English. Unfortunately, this option is not available for the live stream on YouTube. Also, finally, we have allocated 20 minutes for the questions and answers session after Professor Holloway's lecture. Please write your questions in the Q&A box in the webinar room or in the comments section on YouTube. I will also say some part of that in Kurdish. سلاو جوا همیارا او گوتار با awayekî zindîngeha لسر زوم و لسر YouTubeê جبوی کسین کو دناو زوم وبینار دانا امکانا ورگراندنا ج انگلیزی بو کردی کرمانجی هيا هون دکارن لسر ایکونا گلوبه یا کلبنی راست یا روپلا ویا زومه بکرتینن و کردی هلبجرن از ویاجی بیجم کم مخابن ورگرا کردی تنه لسر زوم هيا و لسر یوتیوب نینا. Let me briefly talk about our institute. The Institute of Social Sciences is a center of research and graduate studies in social sciences at the University of Rojava. It was established on October 11, 2020, based in Qamishli in Rojava in northern east region of Syria, with instructors and contributors from all around the world. The University of Rojava itself was founded on July 4, 2016, under the circumstances of war and destruction in Syria. The co-president of the university, Dr. Abdullah Al-Mustafa, will talk more about the university in his welcome message. And without further ado, please join me to welcome the co-president of the University of Rojava, Dr. Abdullah Al-Mustafa, to present their message. Dr. Abdullah Karamka.
ساعات خوش دكتور أزيب كردي باخفم ويج بروفيسور وقران نزل بمانتكم تمام حمو دمي وخش حمو ميفان حمو جهدار حمو كسي جو إيرو مدبينة المجهدار دكي مشهد دكي أبدم حميد دمي وبخير خوشي إن شاء الله هون همي بخير هاتن سرسرا سرجاوا هاتن سپاسیا پجدربونا ودکن گو و اف زحمتك شاند ايرو ما گهدار دکن بناوی هفسروکاتی ریوبر ماموستا خوندکار کارمندین زانگها روجاوا ام بهاتنا بخير هاتنا بريز بروفيسور جون هولوي دکن و ام جنابي گلکی سپاس کن گو اف دم جوختا خو قطاند و اف درفت داما گو ايرو ام کاربن لی گهدار بکن تماشا بکن ام ویم جراوی بالکش به سرناوا هیوی دمین بهیویه ده و ام جی ببهیزن و جمرا شیرووا و گنگشا بکه براستی ام گلکی سپاسیا بدرفتید کن يعني ام جنابي دبيجن جنابي بروفيسور دبيجن گو زانینگها ما ام زانینگها ما بخوا هیویه که دما بهیویه ده جبرگو زانستی زانینه خوندنا زانستی ایرو ام دخینن دما شرده ام ج پروفیسور دبیجن گو برخدانا گلی ما ایرو هیویه که دما بهیویه ده جبرگو لهاول دور لقرقرن و تنبونا ویدگره ام جنابی دبیجن کو بشداربونا وی آمدبونا وی و چه کسی وقت جنابی وینا کسی دموکراسی خواز مروف حسکر آزاد پرور گو تبلی مدبن پشتگیری جمرد کن دبگو هیویک دمی بهیویه دبن براستی گلکی سپاس پروفیسور گو وی درفته گو وی درفتا گودایی زانگها ما زانگها روجاوا وقت مگوت دما شرده هاوتی آوا کرن دناو زحمتیه ده دناو کم درفتیه ده دناو تندو تجیه ده دناو هاو دور خطری و زحمتیه ده هاتی آوا کرن کو هودانا زانینگهک الترناتیو به واتایا الترناتیو به همو واتایا به همو واتایی براستی زانگها ما ایرو 8 فال کلتایا خود گره 3 پیمانگها خود گره خوندکاری وینا نزدیک 2000 خوندکار هنه کارمند و ماموستوی هنه يعني بقولي درفتهم امكانياتي قلقي بتشوك وهندك دسبيكري انا ايرو غافنا دده او غاف غافا افاكرنا تيمي اكاديمي هندري زانگهي گو او سبروج ببن هم تيمي اكاديمي هم تيمي ريفبر هنگي زانگهي گوراجن باري زانگهي او غافا ما غافا گو ام ببینن ايرو غافا پیروز دما شرده گو زانگه ايرو بقاس هودانا دده افغاس کسی دناف جماور حسکر لخود گره ناو زانگه ایرو براسی بلا بویه دناف شخم ملت کرد و دناف پرانیا جهان کسی میرو حسکر کسی دموکراسی خواست کسی گو برابانی دبر ماف مروا دکه ایرو ناو زانگه براسی دناوات بلا بویه و هیوی اجد کن امجی بهیوی نگو او زانگه هیویک به دمی بهیوی جارك ديما بخير هاتن بروفيسور هولوي ام سركفتني جبوه ولا شراوت خوازن كلام كن املو بهدارت
Gelek spas Dr. Abdullah. Thank you so much, Dr. Mustafa. And let me now introduce Dr. Aziz Aslan, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. Aziz Aslan is a Kurdish sociologist living in Mexico. She is also an activist with the Kurdistan Women's Movement. She recently graduated from her PhD studies, and in her PhD dissertation, she investigated the autonomous process of Rojava and the organization of social economy. Her thesis won the Jorge Alonso Chair Award of 2021 and published by the title of Anti-Capitalist Economy in Rojava, Contradictions of the Revolution in the Kurdish Struggle. The thesis was published in Spanish in October 2021. Congratulations. Dr. Aslan is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, where she conducts research about the dialogue between genealogy and Latin American decolonial feminism. She also teaches at the College of Mexico in Middle Eastern Studies on gender and women's struggles in the Middle East. Please join me to welcome Dr. Aslan.
Serdar, thank you so much. And thank you so much also Heval Mustafa. So I'm very excited in the participate this event. And thank you so much also for inviting me. Okay, first of all, I send my hugs and greeting all the people and young and women of Rojava, Northern Syria, and all of Kurdistan. I really have missed being there. So it's my great honor to introduce Professor John Holloway in this historical event. John is a professor at the Instituto de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades in the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla in Mexico, where he teach in the Graduate School of Sociology. John has hundreds of students, and I am one of them. And the most important feature that I admire about John, he is comrade and friend to his students. He regards them as free and contradictory people with their own experience. And I think that's a great support that a professor can give their students on the route to becoming researchers. Personally, he taught me a lot, but above all, to think freely, but also critically, and the vitality to ethically criticize the struggle to which we are committed, question them, and giving an antagonistic dimension to concept of struggle and revolution. John is one of the most prominent thinkers of our time, closely followed by political movements, collectives, people, and intellectuals. He has published widely on Marxism and open Marxism theory, on the Zapatista movement, and on the anti-capitalistic struggles. Lately, he focused on hope. I imagine he will share it with you today. So his book, Chaining the World Without Taking Power, has been translated into more than 11 languages, including Arabic. Hopefully, one day soon, we can find in Kurdish as well. His book sparked an intellectual debate on the content of revolution. He emphasized that the idea of taking power in past revolution was a big mistake that led to their collapse. However, the great learning for changing the world is that today struggle must be anti-power. His later book, Crack Capitalism, took the argument further, suggesting that the only way we can think of revolution today, the creation, expansion, and multiplication and confluence of cracks against and beyond capitalist domination. So some people think John is a Marxist, and some people think he is an anarchist, but I think he is a rebel from heart. When he starts talking, you will see what I mean. Please, John.
Quel espace, Aziz. Quel espace, Serdar. Quel espace, Dr. Mustafa. Dembash. Ezwe bijanudil silavdikem. Geboren es Kurdî Nîsan'imi. Nîsan'im. So I think it's better if I don't try to go any further in Kurdish, but just speak in English. At the same time, I suppose I feel awkward in speaking English because I don't think we should take for granted the Anglicization of academic discourse. Although it facilitates, obviously it makes communication easier. It makes it easier for me to talk to you and for you to talk to me. I think it also has another side because it impoverishes academic thought in the sense that very easily it can distance academic thought from the richness of experience and remove it from wider social connection. So I think there's a sense in which trying to think that all academic discourse should go through English is actually an impoverishment. And I say that not just as a general reflection, but also because richness and impoverishment is really what I want to talk about today. But before that, can I just say, well, obviously, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, because it is a huge, huge honor to be there with you in this Freedom Annual Lecture in Rojava. I've never been to Rojava yet, but for me, obviously, it symbolizes refusal, it symbolizes rebellion, it symbolizes the attempt to create a society beyond capitalism. And I think for me and for millions of people, Rojava really perhaps can be translated by one word: hope. You know, hope that we can get out of this catastrophic situation, hope that we can construct a better world. You know? So thank you very much indeed for this invitation. Before beginning, I suppose I should also say that I feel a certain awkwardness in speaking about the sufferings of capitalism, the sufferings that capitalism brings, and the need to create a different world. And talking about that to people there in Rojava who have lived those sufferings and have struggled to create something else with an intensity that I can only imagine. No? But here I am. So, yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I want to start somewhere else. I want to start with a quote from the wonderful 6th part of the Zapatista Communiqué of October 2020, signed by Subcomandante Moises, in which they announced their plan to visit Europe. The communiqué begins with an analysis of the catastrophic condition of the world. They say, and I quote, "We see and we hear a world that is ill in its social life, fragmented into millions of people alien to one another, busy with their individual survival, but united under the oppression of a system ready to do anything to satisfy its thirst for profit, even when it is clear that its path goes against the existence of the planet Earth." And after developing this analysis in more detail, they reach the conclusion, and I quote again, "And this is what we have decided, that it is again time for hearts to dance, and that neither their music nor their steps should be those of lament and resignation." And that seems to me just absolutely brilliant. No? Here we are in a dreadful, a really dreadful situation in the world, right in the middle of the hopeless times mentioned in the title of this talk. But they say, well, our communists are communizing. Our rebellious response should not be a moan, should not be a lament, but a dance, the dance of the hearts. Turn the misery upside down, break the grammar of domination, start from dance, not from suffering. Start from our richness, not from our poverty. That, it seems to me, is what Marx does in Capital, though I suspect that sometimes he forgets it, and certainly the mainstream of the Marxist tradition forgets it. The first sentence of Capital, the book, reads, "The richness of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities." So the first words are the richness. And that acquires a lot of meaning, I think, if we connect it with what Marx says about richness in his notes for Capital in the Grundrisse. He says, when the limited bourgeois form is stripped away, what is richness other than the universality of human needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., created through universal exchange? The absolute working out of man's creative potentialities sorry, with no presupposition other than the previous historic development, which makes this totality of development, that is the development of all human powers as such, an end in itself, not as measured on a predetermined yardstick, where he does not produce himself in one specificity, but produces his totality, strives not to remain something he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. So Marx begins Capital not with the commodity, as is usually understood, but with richness. And richness, he says, is potentially the absolute movement of becoming, a constant movement of pushing beyond what exists, a pushing against alien determination of our lives towards collective self-determination. I understand richness as the poetry of overflowing, as Raoul van Eyck calls it in a recent book. It is the richness of the dance of our hearts. It is this richness that would be at the center, I think, of a communizing society. But the richness, really to talk about this richness, to talk about the importance of this richness, only makes sense if we understand it as immanent negation, a force that already exists. Although denied, it exists in the form of its denial. It already exists in, against, and beyond capitalism, a force of hope, and not yet, that already exists in the present as refusal, as rebellion. Excuse me. The problem, of course, the problem is that the richness of our overflowing, the richness of our becoming, of what we could be, is entrapped, concealed, perverted, contained. The richness of what we could be is contained and concealed not just by the Syrian state or the Turkish state or the Mexican state or the US state, but behind them stands a greater force, a greater force of containment, the commodity, or in other words, money. As Marx puts it, we go back again to the first sentence of Capital, the richness of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. And the generalization of commodity exchange is inseparable from the rule of money. And that is the dreadful, frightening, terrifying challenge that Marx throws at us. He says, as long as our richness exists in the commodity form, that is, as long as we relate to one another through the exchange of commodities, that is to say, as long as money dominates our lives, then we are caught in a logic that has terrible consequences in terms of exploitation, frustration, poverty, conflict, and the subordination of all our activity and all our dreams directly or indirectly to the pursuit of profit. And now it is clear, in a way that was not clear 50 years ago, that this dynamic of money, this dynamic of profit, not only causes present misery and destruction, but is probably leading us towards extinction. Money is the enemy of richness, the enemy of hope, the enemy of freedom, the enemy of humanity. Money stands not on its own, of course. It is one of the social forms of capitalist social relations. Money stands at the center of a constellation of social forms. Just to mention a few, first, abstract labor. The fact that we relate to one another through money means that the social recognition of our activity, of our life activity, depends on its integration into the logic of money. Our lives are dominated by alienated or abstract labor. Capital, the existence of money, is a drive towards its self-expansion, that is, towards its expansion through the exploitation of labor. Money is inseparable from capital and the constant, uncontrollable drive to accumulate more and more and more. The state, the rule of money is as inseparable as well from the existence of the state. The state as a form of social organization separated from society is totally integrated into the rule of money simply by the fact that it depends on promoting capital accumulation to provide the material basis of its own existence. To break the power of money, it cannot be done through the state. We need a different form of social organization, one based on the integration of social affairs into society itself. Typically, some form of organization such as the commune. Identity. I want to talk about identity as well as a social form connected with money, one of the forms of capitalist social relations. And this is a point that receives attention, I suppose not so frequently, but it seems to me that identity too is part of the constellation of the rule of money. By identity, I mean the opposite of the poetry of overflowing. By identity, I understand a logic of containment, of definition, of clear distinction. The poetry of overflowing implies an understanding of ourselves in terms of mutual recognition. Our lives are part of a flow of life, a flow of interaction with other people and also with other forms of life. Mutual recognition, then, is the recognition of this flow, of the we that is I and the I that is we, as Richard Gunn and Adrian Wilding put it in a recent book, Drawing on Hegel. And its typical form of organization is again the commune. But the rule of money breaks this flow of recognition. The act of commodity exchange breaks the community, defines us as separate individuals, imposes roles upon us, imposes character masks upon our faces. And if we are to break the rule of money, we must go in the opposite direction, understand our struggles as being anti-identitarian in the sense of pushing in against and beyond identity, our identities. And this can be difficult precisely because the aggression of money attacks us through our character masks, through our roles, it puts labels on us. He is a Jew, she is Kurdish, that person is a woman, they are gay, he is black. This is the language of racism, of nationalism, of sexism, but also part of the language of everyday speech. The danger is that in response to the identifying attack of money, we reproduce the same identitarian logic, saying, yes, we are Kurds against the Turks, we are Irish against the English, we are women against men, we are indigenous against the whites. The problem with this is that we then reproduce the same logic, and then there is no way out. In the best of cases, we substitute one form of discrimination for another. Identity must not be confused with richness, because we can certainly speak of the richness of being a Kurd, or the richness of being a woman, or the richness of being gay, with all the experience and imagination and tradition of struggle that those terms imply. But identity is a closure, an exclusion, whereas richness is an opening, a becoming, an overflowing. The distinction between richness, the richness of struggle, and the closure of identification is surely one reason why the history of national liberation struggles has been so tragic. They have often involved the identification or positivization of struggles that in their origins are often driven by an overflowing, a refusal of alien domination. The very notion of national liberation makes little sense. The Zapatistas, although they are still called the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, have in practice abandoned the idea of national liberation long since. In the first part of the communique that I mentioned at the beginning, they speak, and I quote, of the certainty that the struggle for humanity is worldwide, just as the destruction that is taking place does not recognize frontiers, nationalities, flags, languages, cultures, races. So the struggle for humanity is everywhere, all the time. And I suspect that within any movement of resistance, there is a tension between identitarian and anti-identitarian impulses, between, for example, saying we are fighting for indigenous rights and we are fighting for the future of humanity, or between, I suppose, we are struggling for Kurdish autonomy and we are struggling against the world system of capitalism to create a different way of living. Probably this tension is inevitable, but for any struggle to contribute to human emancipation, it must drive in against and beyond its own identitarian tendencies. That refusal to enclose itself within an identity is the power and the beauty of the Zapatista movement, of the movement in Rojava, and of so many other resistances in the world today. Okay. So, money then is at the center of a whole constellation of social forms, at the center of a complex spider's web that holds us in our place as the world hurtles towards disaster. The enemy of richness is money. The enemy of hope and of freedom is money. If our hope is the hope that we can really stop the destruction that is capitalism and create a society based on mutual recognition, then we have to say loud and clear that the enemy is money. And I say money rather than capital, not to indicate a difference. Money and capital are two faces of the same set of social relations. But we are used to thinking of capital as something external, as a they whom we must defeat. And clearly, yes, there is a they, a small group of powerful people who benefit enormously from the existence of capital and are committed to preserving it. But capital is not a thing out there. It is a way of organizing society in which we are complicit. This is clearer if we think of money. Money is the penetration of capitalist social relations into our everyday lives. It is money, or the lack of it, that shapes what we do each day, shapes our education, shapes our health, our ambitions, our sufferings, our despair, our conflicts. And it is money that we reproduce every day in our relations with other people. So if we speak of money rather than capital, then it becomes clearer that the problem is not so much or not just to defeat a they, a them, but that we have to defeat a way of relating to one another, a way of doing things. Money is the enemy of hope, the enemy of humanity. We must abolish money as a way of relating to one another, but sometimes it is very difficult to say this. And I think it is difficult for two reasons. It's difficult to say it, firstly, because it is obvious, and secondly, because it is mad, it is ridiculous. The first, then, is that it is obvious. We all know that it is the existence of money that is the determination of social activity by the restless pursuit of profit. We all know that that is behind global warming. We know that it is behind the multiplication of pandemics, the destruction of biodiversity, the elimination of languages, the elimination of cultures, the illness and suffering of millions and millions of people, and so on. It is the existence of money that is taking us closer and closer to the edge of extinction. And that's probably something we're all aware of. I mean, you don't have to be particularly radical to see that. And yet, we don't say it very often. And we don't say it perhaps because we think it's simply stating the obvious. No, we don't go around saying the sky is blue either. I'm talking about the Mexican sky, not the Scottish sky, of course. No. But we don't go around saying that because it's obvious, no? And we don't go around saying, well, money is behind the social destruction that we're suffering because it's obvious. But I think there's another reason why we don't say it. And that is, yes, because it seems ridiculous. It seems completely impossible. It seems even unthinkable. It seems mad. You want to abolish money? You must be insane. There is what might be called an impossibility taboo surrounding the abolition of money. It is impossible. Therefore, we don't talk about it. And I think this is something that becomes very clear in the discussions during the pandemic. No? So many people saying, yes, I mean, this pandemic shows us the need to change our lives radically, to change society radically. But nobody mentions the abolition of money, because that is beyond what we can think. That is beyond what seems to be possible. So I think that hope, freedom, because this is a freedom lecture, means breaking the rule of money. And that means as well breaking this impossibility taboo, no, that makes it even difficult to say we must abolish money. And I think there are two ways of going forward in this. One is to focus on current struggles and the way in which they try to get rid of money or push money to the side as much as possible. The way in which, and also the way in which struggles overflow from more immediate demands to question the existence of money. This approach is illustrated, for example, in a very nice new book by Anitra Nelson called Beyond Money. But there is another way of approaching the subject, which I try to develop in my book called Hope and Hopeless Times, which should come out in October if all is well. And I go in a different direction. I argued there that we have to look not just at our own refusals and resistances, but also how these resistances and refusals weaken the enemy, as how our struggles enter into money and constitute its crisis. Money is a way of channeling our activity, our daily activity, what we do every day, in a way that produces more and more capital, in a way that has dreadful consequences for humanity. But if we think of that, if we think of money as a way of channeling our activity, then it also means that capital and money depends on us. If it cannot succeed in channeling our activity in a certain way into the patterns of behavior that it requires, then it is in trouble. It will have difficulty in reproducing itself. And we, all the time, fight back against the logic of money. We do it consciously. We try and organize our lives in different ways, but also we do it all the time just because for us, that is what humanity means. No, that is playing with our children, that is talking to friends, that is all that we mean by friendship and love and comradeship. All that is a refusal. No, it is a refusal of the rule of money. It is a refusal of the determination of our daily activity by money. No. So capital, like all rulers, lives in fear. I think it is a double fear. A fear that we will not produce enough surplus to ensure its reproduction, and a fear that we will no longer tolerate the terribly destructive system in which we live. This second fear, the fear that we will no longer tolerate, has been at the heart of money and monetary development for the last century. When Roosevelt responded to all the social pressures arising from after the crash of 1929 and came off the gold standard in 1933, Bernard Baruch, a leading Democrat politician, said, "It can't be defended except as mob rule. Maybe the country doesn't know it yet, but I think that we may find that we've been in a revolution more drastic than the French Revolution. The crowd has seized the seat of government and is trying to seize the wealth. Respect for law and order is gone." And I suppose I think that Baruch was right. I think he saw something that we didn't see. I think he saw the dangers of the failure of money to contain social activity and social behavior within the logic of capital, of money. And the argument of Keynes was essentially the same, but from the other side. From the other side, in the sense that for him, it was necessary to let the mob or the rabble into the center of money. Or it was necessary to recognize their strength and let them into the center of economic policy. So right at the end, in the last closing pages of his most important book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, first published in 1936, he says, "It is certain that the world will not much longer tolerate the unemployment which is associated, and in my opinion, inevitably associated with capitalistic individualism." In other words, he was arguing for the postponement of capitalist crisis through state intervention, and therefore arguing too for the weakening of the discipline of money in order, because he was afraid that the world would not much longer tolerate the operation, the sufferings caused by capitalism if this were not done. And his opponents, the people that he called the Old World Party, they argued, no, that this was just to store up disaster for the future. Keynes replied in his well-known phrase that that did not matter, because in the long run, we are all dead. And that was 90 years ago. and Keynes, yes, is dead. But we are now in his long run, and we are living the disaster of which Keynes's opponents warned. Since the 1970s, and especially since 1982, the representatives of capital have been doing everything possible to postpone or avoid crisis, not so much by state intervention, but by expanding debt through the banks. That is, by creating a fictitious capitalism, by creating money that does not correspond to value actually produced. The enormous and unprecedented expansion of debt over the last 40 years, this is not just an ordinary bubble, this is the huge and long-term expansion of debt like never before. This enormous expansion of debt is an attempt to contain our richness, our potential, our refusals and resistances and rebellions inside the discipline of a system that does not work. Baruch was right. The mob, the rabble, we, our richness, entered into money, and capital has not yet succeeded in pushing us out again. The fictitious capital that has grown and grown over the past 40 years has made capitalism increasingly inefficient, volatile, and aggressive. The system almost broke down in 2008 with disastrous social consequences throughout the world, and again in 2020 at the start of the pandemic, and it is still in a highly fragile condition. The Fed, the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, and other leading central banks are now trying to reduce global indebtedness very sharply. To the extent that they succeed, it is likely to bring misery and conflict to millions and millions of people throughout the world. They're talking now of raising the rate of interest by 0.5% in May. And the 0.5% in the rate of interest, you think, well, okay, that's not very interesting. But in fact, it is likely to lead to poverty and starvation for millions throughout the world. And the last time there was a serious attack on the expansion of debt under the Fed led by Paul Volcker between 1979 and 1982. In the end, they had to abandon it. But in the process, one of the effects was to cause a collapse in the Mexican economy, to reduce the wages, the incomes of most people in the country drastically. And no doubt it contributed to the rise of violence, the rise of the narcotic industry that we are living with now. So this attempt to cut down on the expansion of debt is likely to have huge social consequences, but also, I suspect, that their fear of the rabble will mean that they cannot actually take it very far. They cannot take it as far as they would like, and that the fictitious and fragile condition of capital will continue. No? They will try to raise the rates of interest. They will try to to reduce the presence of debt in the world economy. But it seems likely to me that fairly quickly they are going to be forced to drop their most radical plans. Money, then, is not just a destructive, but also a fragile form of relating to one another. And this, I suppose, is what makes it possible to challenge the impossibility taboo. No, it will become less and less difficult, less and less insane to say, money is dreadful, it's a disaster, it doesn't work, let's abolish it. And that seems to me that if humanity is to have a chance of survival, then the attempt to abolish money, the idea of abolishing money, must become an element of everyday life. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, I think, in an extremely dangerous situation where the prolonged postponement of the crisis of capital through debt expansion, the prolonged postponement of crisis induced and maintained by the fear that the world will not much longer tolerate this ridiculous system in which we live. It seems now that this prolonged postponement is leading us into all sorts of catastrophes. And in this context, all sorts of struggle are important. The struggle against patriarchal violence, the struggle against racism, the struggle against the repression of indigenous people, the struggle against the destruction of biodiversity, against global warming, against the growing authoritarian nature of states throughout the world. These refusals, resistance, and rebellions are the substance of hope, and there should be no hierarchy among them. And yet, they often leave unspoken something that is present in the movement, something that overflows from the movements, from really all of the movements. And that is the awareness that the realization of our hopes requires the abolition of capital, the abolition of money. No? And if we think, for example, of the struggle for the conservation of biodiversity, no? Against the massacre of other forms of life, no? That is taking place, that seems to me a very important struggle. But implicit in it, but rarely made explicit, is really the realization that it is the shaping of the world by the pursuit of profit that is leading to this massacre of other forms of life. But I think that's probably the way we should think about the struggle to abolish money, because at this moment, for me, it is hard to imagine a movement that takes to the streets and calls for the abolition of money. Let's abolish money. It's hard to imagine it on a whole multitude of placards, for example. But for me, then it's easier to think of the movement to abolish money as an overflowing from other movements. If we want to stop global warming, we must get rid of money. If we want to stop patriarchal violence, I would say we must get rid of money. If we want to stop racism, again, we must get rid of money. If we want to stop the current rush towards extinction, then we must get rid of money. Not that the abolition of money would solve all the problems, but it would clear the ground for thinking about them and tackling them profoundly. So in conclusion, dance, then dance. Dance against the power of money. Sing, then, sing. Sing out the power of our richness. Sing out the power of that which cannot be contained. Sing out the power of that which is not contained. Gelek spas.
Thank you so much, Professor Holloway. It was incredibly thought-provoking, very wonderful, fantastic talk. And for some reasons, in the last couple of weeks, I have also been increasingly thinking about money. So it was really wonderful to hear about what you're thinking about this very topic and as a source of all the evil in the world, of course. We have some questions and some comments on YouTube. I want to use my privilege and actually start with a question. I actually have many questions, but I'll just start with the first one. As someone from the Middle East region, to be honest, and it's not just that Middle East region, but also probably it's a phenomenon around the world increasingly, the question of authoritarianism and the nation state becoming too powerful and kind of in some places an imperial force, as in we see the examples of emerging examples of Turkey in the region, like a sub-imperial force that is strictly standing on the very idea of Turkish nationalism. I want to follow up with your discussions of richness and identity politics to ask, where do we put the state here? And of course, probably the main reason is, of course, the very existence of money and the relationships that are established based on that. But how this richness, like when you see identity politics mixed with nation state policies, becoming a negation of richness, and following up on that, there's also a question. I'm really wondering if you have read Öcalan's books and his paradigm of democratic confederalism, that is kind of a response to the richness of different identities and cultures, especially in the region, but probably you can adopt it everywhere else. And the example of Rojava has shown how this coexistence and working together between all of these communities are creating a revolutionary experience. So I'll start with that, and we'll see if more questions are coming. Should we do one by one, Professor Holloway?
Perhaps, yes.
Okay, so let's start with that, and I will probably combine questions and then ask you. Please.
With that one. Yes. It's difficult. I mean, it's really, it kind of going back to what I said at the start. I'm standing here in Puebla. Many of you are in Rojava. You have a very different experience from my experience. And I suppose what I'm saying, one of the things that struck me in Aziz's thesis, now book, in the introduction, really powerful account of the discrimination against Kurds simply because they are Kurds. No, the discrimination obviously in Turkey and in other places. No, and it seems to me inevitable and right and necessary that you get a reaction to defend the Kurds as Kurds and say, yes, of course we must speak our own language, of course we must enjoy our own traditions, of course we must be proud of those traditions, which are also traditions of struggle. And in a way, what I'm trying to say is, I think that within any movement like that, there are really kind of two different impulses. One is to say, yes, we are Kurds, we must construct or defend the Kurdish nation, or we must even create a Kurdish state, which of course you're not trying to do in Rojava. The other tendency, I think, is to say, yes, we are discriminated and oppressed as Kurds, but we must break with all that grammar. We must create something new. We must go beyond the logic of identity, and that means going beyond the logic of the state, no? Creating different forms of organization, which obviously, I mean, as I understand it, is really what Jolan is saying, is what you are trying to do or doing in Rojava. I suppose I'm just saying, well, those tensions must be there in any movement. And it's really important to stay with the anti-identitarian impulse, the impulse that goes beyond that. And part of the problem is that the vocabulary we have inherited from traditional Marxism is in some ways very identitarian, in the sense that a lot of the discussion and a lot of the theory was about seizing control of the state, or blaming the state, or blaming other states. So I think the concept of imperialism, for example, is part of that vocabulary, which seems to me no longer helpful. No? The notion of imperialism encourages us to think of social antagonisms in territorial or geographical terms. And I think that's not what social antagonism is about. Social antagonism is really about the way that life is organized. So it's, I don't know if it sounds a complicated argument. It's a way of expressing my huge admiration for what you're doing in Rojava.
Great, thank you so much. So questions are coming, but maybe following up on that question, there's or discussions of richness and identity and closure. There's a question says that if Black Lives Matter as a movement can be a form of this identity and closure, or maybe like part of this richness or refusal that you were talking about.
To talk more about the richness and yeah, I mean, I think one of the dangers of traditional, of the kind of old Marxist theory or traditional Marxist theory is that it starts from the object. No, we analyze, or we used to analyze, capital and value. And I think in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a fairly drastic shift to the subject, to looking at movements. But that in that process, I suppose I feel that the antagonism between subject and object has been lost, or is in danger of being lost. That many times we think of the movements, but we forget to think, well, yes, but this is in the context of capital, this is in the context of money. And the problem there, you know, we can, of course we must look at all these movements, no? But the problem all the time is, well, how do we get rid of capital? How do we get rid of money? And if we think of, I suppose, the way I read Capital, the book, Marx is really talking about the commodity and money as a way of containing us, as a way of containing our lives within a certain logic. Okay, we all know that. We every single day think of what you did today, think of, you know, and you'll think, yes, I mean, how did money shape your physical activity today? How did it shape the way you talk to people? How did it shape what you ate? And we know the force of money as a way of containing what we can do. And we know also how we, all the time, I think, maybe not consciously, rebel against that. We try to create other ways of doing things, other ways of thinking, other ways of shaping our lives. I mean, in that sense, I suppose the University of Rojava is all about that. It's about trying to create other ways of thinking that don't fit in with the logic of money. No? And I think that's what I understand by richness. It's a recognition of what we already have, but a recognition as well that that richness exists in conflict with the totalizing systemic effect of money or capital.
Great, because the following question is actually just about this recognition. So Jihad is asking, thank you very much for your great lecture, Professor Holloway. My question is, how is mutual recognition to be realized? What forms of institutions or structure does mutual recognition need to be established in order for that to be realized? How does the Hegelian interpretation of mutual recognition that you mentioned differ from the mutual recognition as advocated by Charles Taylor and Axel Honneth? And there's another question about identity, but probably I'm going to leave that after your response to this one, because I think it's more about the moment again. So please.
Did you say that that question came from Jihad?
Jihad, yes.
Yes, lovely. Yeah, I think, I suppose when we think, well, what is it that we want? No, what is it that we're struggling for? We're not struggling for a return to the Soviet Union. If we think about what it would have been like to live in Moscow in the 1950s or 1960s, we think, no, that's certainly not what we want. And the same, I think, very much the same with China. No, what we want is for me, what we want is a self-determining society. But a self-determining society has to be collective. And I don't mean self-determining in the sense of national self-determination, no. I mean in terms of collective some form of collective self-determination. And that collective self-determination really has to be based on mutual recognition. The Zapatistas, right at the beginning of their uprising, put a lot of emphasis on dignity as the central concept. No? I know also that the wonderful shack dwellers movement in South Africa, Abaklali, no, they too say, well, dignity is our central concept. And I think dignity is that. It is not only that we act with dignity, that we refuse and rebel, but that we recognize other people's dignity. We try to develop a society based on the mutual recognition of dignities. You know? And yes, in that I'm very influenced by the work of Richard Gunn and Adrian Wilding, you know, they who build upon Hegel and have been doing it for years and years, to say, yes, I mean, that's really for Hegel. That is what the French Revolution was about. It was the struggle, this is for the young Hegel, the struggle for dignity and the recognition by all of us, I suppose, of the I that is we and the we that is I. Now, we can think, if we think of forms of social organization, I mean, obviously assemblies and councils and communes, they all have their problems, but they're a push towards, I think, in the best of cases, they're a push towards the implementation, the working out of that sort of mutual recognition.
Thank you very much. So I know we did talk about identity, like focus more on that in the Q&A, but there's another question by Professor Özlem Göner, which I really want to read, and if you can address it as well. She says, though I understand the imaginary hope of universalism and the necessity of such revolutionary imagination, identities, ones that people mobilize against capitalism in different forms, have been central in anti-capitalist struggles. Can identity, not in the form of nationalism and national liberation, but as historically situated in struggles of emancipation, be actually central to a global freedom movement, perhaps by making connection to the other oppressed? So it's kind of, again, connected to Rojava, and then the question about Black Lives Matter and indigenous struggles, I would say, across Turtle Island and Latin America.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think, yes, clearly identity can be an important point of coalescence for social movements, movements of rebellion, you know. I mean, of course, at some level, I want to say, oh yes, we are the Irish, we are against the English. No? I mean, in a sense, I grew up with that. But if it doesn't go beyond that, it seems to me that there's always the tension there between an enclosure, a kind of an identitary enclosure, which can very quickly become extremely reactionary or even fascist. If we think of what Irish independence meant in the end, if we think of the existence of Israel as a state, then you can see, if you think, yeah, I mean, then you can see the way in which that kind of identitarian push becomes an enclosure, becomes a discrimination, becomes horrible, no? And that's why I want to say anti-identitarian, but when I mentioned anti-identitarian at the beginning, I said in the sense of something that goes in, against, and beyond the identity, right? So if we think, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, yes, of course, that's very important. But at some point, it has to go beyond that. It has to overflow. It has to say, yes, but this racism isn't just racism. It's part of a whole social system which oppresses us as blacks and oppresses us as women and as workers and as et cetera, no? Because the danger is that these movements organized around an identity can simply lead to the substitution of one identity for another. And then we're just reproducing the whole same whole system.
Mhm. Perfect. There is one question from our YouTube audience. The question is, there are resonances with the debates of the Austrian Marxists on cultural national autonomy, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this and what parallels you see between these and Öcalan's ideas.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that. Can you?
Sure, I will read it again. There are resonances with the debates of the Austrian Marxists on cultural national autonomy, and I wondered what your thoughts are on this and what parallels you see between these and Öcalan's ideas. So the question is basically about the notion of cultural national autonomy from Austrian Marxists, something that I'm not so familiar.
Well, firstly, I proclaim my ignorance of those debates. Secondly, no, I think cultural, I mean, just from the name, the idea of cultural national autonomy, for me, doesn't make sense. I think any notion of a national culture tends to obliterate the social divisions, the social antagonisms that exist within the society. No? The very notion of nation, I think, is a lie. No, a lie in the sense that it conceals, paints over the antagonisms that exist in a society.
Right.
You know? It's a very powerful lie. It's a very destructive lie. It's a lie that is what led to the death of millions and millions and millions of people in the last century. But it does seem to me, yes, it's a lie.
Thank you very much. Maybe the very final one, and it's also kind of a comment that the world is not very hopeful images that we are seeing today, but things that are happening all around the world, of course. And there's a feeling of that we are not winning, and how can we keep faith in the struggles, which I feel that you already responded, but also from our students, the University of Rojava, and Nujin is asking, what is the possibility of creating this alternative different world without getting trapped by the system, the capitalist system that is built around the very money that you discussed?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. No, the situation at the moment seems to be catastrophic. No, we're faced with just a few weeks ago, the threat of nuclear war. With, of course, the possibility of a series of pandemics. No, over the last 2 years, we've been living in conditions that we could not have imagined possible before. We know that global warming is going ahead and that the state promises to reduce that warming are simply not being met. So I suppose part of my problem is that I came into all these discussions of Marxism, etc., through reading Bloch Ernst Bloch's book, The Principle of Hope, years and years ago.
Yeah.
And then about 10 years ago, I suppose when I finished Crack Capitalism, I started thinking, now I want to write a book about hope, which would be in a way a homage to Bloch. And it's just very difficult. That's the problem, isn't it? It's very difficult to think hope. No? And one of the things that Bloch says on his first page of the book is that hope is in love with success. And I think that's just so important. It can't be just a question of saying, oh, we hope, we'll go and dance in the fields, or we'll set up our little community and we'll hope. It has to go deeper than that. It actually has to say, well, yes, hope means breaking the destructive dynamic of capital. And can we really think about that when we no longer have the revolutionary parties that existed 50, 60 years ago? How do we think about it? And I suppose that's really my obsession. And I think it's not easy. I think that it doesn't make sense to think about hope without thinking about the opposite, about the hopelessness of the present situation. And I suppose my way of thinking about hope is to say, well, no, if we think about hope seriously, we have to go against money. We have to see if there is some way in which our struggles have entered into money and weaken money so that it becomes possible to think of a different way of organizing social relations. And I think that is the case. And I think we're now probably heading into a situation, in the next 5, 10 years, where there will be more and more uprisings in the world, more and more people saying, no, we cannot live with this system. Either literally we cannot live, we cannot find food, or we cannot accept what it means. And I think those uprisings can go in 2 different directions. They can become very, very nasty fascist movements, or they can become movements to really transform society on a different basis. And there, for me, movements like the movement in Rojava are of fundamental importance, not only for you who are living there or who have a direct relation, but it's of fundamental importance for the world and for the future of the world. But there's, about a year ago, there were riots in South Africa, riots that became racist riots in some parts, and directed against people from Zimbabwe, for example. And Abahlali, this shack dwellers group in South Africa, their comment was, well, yes, this is really the problem. We have always said that the anger of the poor can turn in different directions. Okay? So we're living in a world, I think, where we're faced by the possibility of, or the likelihood of rising anger. And that rising anger can go in different directions. And what we have to do in some way, in whatever way we could do it, is to try and ensure that it goes in the direction of creating a society based on mutual recognition. And for that, Sardar, really, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this invitation today.
Thank you so much for you, Professor Holloway. That was really fantastic. So much that we need to think about, to follow. and to explore. I really, really hope that our conversation continues between the University of Rojava and the University of Puebla, and hopefully to have you in other occasions, but most importantly to have you in Rojava and have these discussions in person, face to face. I will conclude, but before that, Aziza, is there anything that you want to say as final words?
Thank you, Serdar. Great lecture, John. It's fantastic. Fantastic dialogue. I love it. And also, I think it's very important to talk about hope in the same time, talk about money for Rojava, because it's very big problem in Rojava, this issue. I just want to say thank you so much, Serdar. Thank you so much, Jalil. Also, thank you, Milena. She is helping the John for organizing this event. And I hope we can visit to Rojava with John one day, because when I was there, I really believe in we can change the world. Still, we can change the life, and this is hope. Yeah, thank you so much.
Fantastic. And by the way, John, somebody on YouTube said it wasn't a lecture, it was poetry. Beautiful. So I just want to say that as well. A manifesto for a poetry manifesto for revolutionary ways of thinking and being and living. So thank you so much again. And I would like to also extend our gratitude to Jalil Kaya, who took on the interpretation work of this lecture, to the poster designer of the lecture, who unfortunately has to remain anonymous, and to all of those who helped us to organize this, and to all of you who followed this lecture on Zoom and on YouTube. The video will stay on the University of Rojava's YouTube channel, and hopefully in future maybe we can put Kurdish subtitles. And I would like to also remind that the Institute of Social Sciences is working on a summer school program on the theme of decolonization again, and details will be shared with you soon. Please follow the university's Facebook and or Twitter page for more and for the announcement of the summer school. And with that, we come to the end of our lecture today. Have a wonderful weekend and stay safe and healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Quel espace.
Quel espace.